There are a lot of ways that people have tried to find out what's going to happen. They've been throwing the bones, reading the tea leaves, scrying into a black obsidian shoe stone, in trying to intuit the very energetic patterns which interact with the fabric of the universe and perhaps being itself. But if I could see into the future, I'd get over to Esportspools and make some fantasy contests, pick all the right players who are going to do well in the big tournaments, perhaps E-League Premier. I'd bet on matches that are coming up in Pro League. I'd even use the in-play betting aspect, which I can tell you will be there in the future, where you can bet during live games on different factors. Now, consider this scene. Olaf Meister is arguably Sweden's greatest ever CSGO player. And he has just won a Tier 1 tournament, one of the big tournaments of the year, just a few weeks ago. Now, what's the problem, you might think? Well, the problem is he wasn't playing for a Swedish team. In fact, he is the only Swedish player in his team, and he wasn't even close to the best player on his team. An IP won a DreamHack tournament just a couple of months ago. Problem is, it was a Tier 2 tournament with arguably Tier 3 teams even, no top teams in attendance, and so ultimately it didn't mean a whole lot. You look at Sweden's best results over the last 4 or 5 months. Okay, so we had NIP finish top 4 at Malmo, narrowly. They were close to losing 2-0 to Navi on Nuke, a map that Navi barely even plays. Fnatic got out of their group at E-League Premier, but it was kind of a weak group. It was one of the best teams in it, in theory, was Immortals. They had a stand-in. Fnatic finished top 8 at the major. But that was a result where they lost to Gambit, one of the teams that at that point in time was not expected to go far. That should have perhaps been a top 4 finish. They'd beaten the very same Gambit team just a couple of months earlier at DreamHack Summer. NIP didn't even qualify for the minor. A Swedish team hasn't played in the final of a CSGO major since ESL1 Cologne 2015, where Fnatic won. Now, that was over 2 years ago. And since then, we've had 4 majors. Sweden currently has 0 top 10 teams as of this moment. NIP still keep the old stars, have added in some new talent, trying to find a good hybrid between the two. Fnatic lost its big fraggers, its big names of the last year or so, has had to go back to basics, try and have a team play aspect, but using tactics from an up-and-coming in-game leader in Golden, who was in their academy team before. Godsent is a mess where they've got some talented players and they've got players who've been parts of successful teams, but never all together, and they don't really have a great history all of playing with each other, and there's not really a clear direction in terms of the leadership element of the team. So if we look to the past, I think that can kind of help us divine some of what the future might be for the Swedish scene. Because Sweden is the greatest country in the history of Counter-Strike in terms of success. And it's not even close. They won by far the most tournaments in Counter-Strike, even in CSGO if you add them up together as well. They were the best overall for the first 3 years or so of CSGO because they had NIP, who was the first dominant team. They had Fnatic, arguably the greatest team. What made Sweden the best, though, throughout the history of Counter-Strike and going into CSGO was that typically their teams were the best at team play. So that was their primary quality. It wasn't that they had the best tactics. Oftentimes Danish or French teams had those elements down. It wasn't that they had always the best players. They've often had very good players, but you look at some other countries and they certainly could produce players just as good. It was nearly always that they had the best team play of all the teams out there. And so they would win in the clutch situations, they would win in the 2v2 situations, they would be able to play without necessarily very in-depth tactics, but still adapt to what they're doing because they could do things that they hadn't necessarily prepared for and improvise in that sense because of having such fantastic team play. You think of all the great teams in history, and this is what you've got. Now, there were very rare teams and periods of time that were very tactical. So, for example, Vestlin, guy who now works over at Snipe, was one of the great in-game leaders from Sweden. And in the early days, the first half of the 2000s, his teams were pretty tactical teams. And he had teams that were like second or third best in Sweden and won a couple of majors. He won a major with NIP, but then later on, he won a major with his Team 9 Esports United squad. He won the first ESWC with a very tactical style, one of the first teams to really master economical management. Later on, you had The eyeballers team of Hyper and Vilden. Hyper sometimes being the in-game leader, Vilden being a secondary caller or in-game leader depending on the era and time. And then that spanned over to Vilden being the in-game leader of SK Gaming, the team that went back-to-back in 2005. So obviously the eyeballers team won the CPL summer event in 2004 and unseated SK. These were very tactical teams, but beyond that, the tactical guys weren't the ones who succeeded the most. So, for example, Threat in the last sort of 3 to 4 years of CS 1.6, very tactical guy, someone who really did try to run proper roles and proper tactics and really good flash timings. Always stuck in the third best Swedish team for essentially most of his career, had his talents taken from him to the teams that were the more team play oriented style, where you stack a bunch of skilled players and then you try to hope you get the right mix of team play. And if it's a team like Fnatic, you build up that team play over time. So you think of Khan's teams with Forest and Get Right later coming in, but before that it was mainly Forest, and then you had DSN who's pretty good, you know, Tempo's pretty good, but these are more like team play all around stars, not fragging stars in the same way. It's only later with the Gooks and Get Right lineup that you're going for the mad fragging, and even then you're playing off team play, because they didn't just kill everyone on the server, they killed everyone on the server, but the way they played off each other was so fluid, it was so heavy hitting, but there was clearly some social understanding of what they were trying to accomplish within that. Beyond that, you've got Potty's teams with Heaton, they never had the best tactics. Vestler's teams had better tactics, but they had better players and they had better team play overall because they had the best players that fit together the best. Those are the two qualities that had to align to make these the best teams. Then you had Vale and Raban's SK Gaming teams of the last sort of 4 to 5 years of 1.6, and these were teams again which tried to get a lot of individual talent, and actually they would make a lot of roster moves primarily because when it didn't work out with a player, they would just get someone else good in and then hope that the fit worked with them, and if it worked with them, they'd stick with them. So they had a player called Crystal at one point in time. They had a bunch of different talented players. Dennis, who's now in Godsent, was in their team at one point in time, but they didn't feel like the fit was perfect, so they got another talented player till they had talented players, but talented players who played well with each other, and in almost sort of an unspoken element. Yes, you play a lot to build it up, but some of it's natural, some of it is organic, how this team play emerges. Then you go and you look at CSGO. So the first dominant team was NIP. Now, it's not that NIP had cracked the way to play the game and no one else understood it all. There were very good teams around that time. There was very good players around that time. But they had not only some of the best players, but they could play around them the best. That's the key element. They had Get Right and Forrest, who very much played those very defined opposite end of the spectrum styles of play. Forrest is like that second entry guy, very aggressive but very talented fragger. Get Right as the really consistent lurker presence who either threatened the map or come in and win the clutches, and the others played around that and played set roles to make those work, but they still would only go as far as those big players could take them ultimately, but the team play between them made them seem unbeatable for a long time. They had good role players in Exist and Freiburg. I mean, you look at the post-Fifth Lauren era when NIP very rarely won anymore, and they were trying to prop up some of their firepower issues by bringing in fraggers. They brought in Makaleli, who was kind of a spark plug player. They had Alu, stable AWPer, so they had that presence in the team they'd never really had. They had Pitt, who was more of like a good fragging support player, pretty stable player overall, but they were never the best anymore. They never really had the best team play anymore. There was less of the NIP magic than there had been in the past years. You look at the Fnatic team, which obviously primarily dominated in 2015, arguably the greatest team to ever played CSGO. They team played very well around their star player, Olofmeister. Now, he was arguably the best player in the whole world. So you add in really good team play with the best player, you're going to go really far in this game, as, by the way, SK Gaming showed us in 2016. But not only did they have the best individual player and good team play, but what made that up? Well, they had smart players, Crims, Flusher, who can make their own decisions within the context of what they're doing and are very stable in terms of how they play. They had a very unpredictable playmaker element to go along with the predictable playmaker element of Olofmeister. They had the unpredictable element of JW, who, because the rest of the team was so stable and played to the structure so well, he could go out there and cause havoc, which only aided what they were doing elsewhere. Or the other element could prop him up at times. And you go along with Olofmeister. They had a good mixture of aggression and passive play there. And then they had the in-game leader, who was at the time an all-right fragger for an in-game leader, and had good mid-round reads if they needed to switch something up. But again, that's not deep, in-depth tactics. That's just reading what we do now and where should we switch up the attack. This is the style that made Sweden the greatest, that kept them the greatest for the longest time with different recruiting strategies, as you'll notice, and allowed them again and again to become number one. So we look at the scene as it stands right now, and the murderer's row of teams in the way of all these Swedish sides, and we ask, how can Swedish teams get back to the top? And as I said, by looking to the past, we can divine what the future might tell us, which is Sweden has to have teams that get there by team play. Because look at the teams we have right now. We have FaZe, who at the moment is just full of monster fraggers. You're not going to, in theory, outskill them, especially not if you're a Swedish team right now, because they don't have many players in good form and in the top 10 type lists in the world. So FaZe, skill-wise, they're way ahead of you at this point in time. G2 has a very high skill level also and has a very good fluid style, and now is starting to get a grip on very good economic management. So again, you're not really going to beat them in skill. You're not going to beat them by just having the best loose style either. You're going to have fantastic team play to overcome situations where you get into clutch scenarios with them, to get the first kills, to play from behind at times when their skilled players get a kill on you. SK Gaming has still got some world-class players, still arguably the best player in the world in coldzera, and a lot of experience through every other member of the team, barring Phobs, who's actually in very good form at the moment. So again, you're not going to outskill them. They've got experience to match pretty much all the Swedish teams out there. Astralis has a great style, and even as their individuals dip a little bit, it's a very consistent style. They get a lot of T rounds. It's really tough to beat them out, and they have a very deep map pool. So again, could you outskill Astralis? Yeah, maybe, but the rest of their style will probably take you apart if you're a loose style, because that's what allowed them to succeed, and only the greatest loose styles are being able to get big series wins off them and defeat them ultimately. So Sweden needs to go back to that team play strength and get the right lineups that work together in a sense, not just who the best fragging lineups are, because that's the only obvious way for them at the moment to go back to the top. Like NIP needs it because they have skill that they can do a lot with, but just having some skill in a very simple loose style, that's not really going to cut it against this level of competition, because you see that in different ways you'd get picked apart and counted by all those teams. So if they have good team play among them, they have a couple of players who play fantastically in one site, so you can't hit that site as much, you have to overload the other site. This is where you start to see how NIP could start to get wins and start to get back in contention. Fnatic need really good team play so that they can go back to when it was late 2014 and JW was not just this unpredictable, but one of the best players in the world. They need that to happen again. So they need the other elements of the team to be a fantastic team play core so that it empowers him to be the star player and to shine, because then they have a kind of an X factor, a joker that no other team really has at the moment in terms of how unpredictable he is, but also how skilled he is at the moment. So they need that core to enable that to work. But you have players like Flusher and Crims, some of the best we've ever had at stable play, at playing defensively, at playing in a way where they make smart reads themselves without the in-game leader having to make them for them. And then in their team, they maybe don't have as much raw skill at the moment as some of the other teams, especially not those big names that I read off, FaZe, G2, SK. So they're going to also rely on a little bit of tactics from Golden, and they're going to try and weave in a hybrid tactical style as well, which we haven't really seen in Sweden for quite a while right now. But that's the word on the street, that they want Golden to go fully tactically into the team and take it over in that sense. Then you've got the Godsent team. Now, Godsent has decent fraggers. They have a couple of people, Dennis, Twist, who obviously at times have looked like fantastic talents and could be among the world's best players. Their big problem is they don't really have the leadership. So either they're going to need some miraculous team play that just works off each other, which it's very rare you get it from a mixed team like that, or they're going to have someone really develop as an in-game leader to make that side gel together, because individually, could they do it? It's very unlikely all those players are going to peak at the same point in time. So they seem the least likeliest, despite the fact that they initially have some advantages by having a good mix of players overall. So for me, team play was always the way Sweden was dominated, was always the core quality of their best teams, even though they obviously had very good elements elsewhere, like having some of the best players and some good tactics at times, and definitely a good understanding of the metagame. But really, that's been the defining quality, and that is the quality that can take them closer to the top again, and perhaps one day with the right lineup to the top again.
Guys, I'm BW. I have won 3 majors in CSGO, and this is Thorin's YouTube channel.